still remember the color of the ballroom, that kind of gold that pretends to be elegant but smells like ego. My sister's wedding didn't look like love. It looked like an empire celebrating itself. There were flowers everywhere, cameras too. And my father was radiant, not because his daughter was happy, but because her happiness made him look successful. I stood near the back, a glass of champagne in hand, trying to blend in. A tailored suit, a polite smile, the estranged son returning for one last performance. Then came the toast, the moment that would turn an ordinary evening into a lifelong scar. My father rose, glass in hand. The crowd went quiet. They always did when he decided to speak. He looked around slowly, savoring the attention. He was a man who'd learned that silence was power, and he knew how to use it. Today, he began, is a proud day for me. A pause, always a pause. Because I'm not only celebrating the union of my daughter, but the confirmation of something I've always known, that she is, and has always been, the only child who never disappointed me. The room erupted in applause. I didn't move. It wasn't anger that hit me first. It was absence, that clean, surgical kind of emptiness that leaves you weightless. My sister turned her head. Just for a second, our eyes met. There was shame in hers, maybe guilt, but beneath that, fear. The kind of fear that comes from being loved conditionally. My father smiled and clinked his glass. The sound was sharp, precise, and in that tiny moment of celebration, I realized something terrible. He meant every word. I watched him embrace my new brother-in-law, patting his back like a man blessing his successor. Around them, people laughed, glasses chimed, cameras flashed. Everyone celebrated love, except me. I was mourning it. People think disappointment is an event. It's not. It's a slow erosion, a quiet wearing away of worth until one day someone says it out loud and everyone cheers. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. My legs refused to move. Instead, I watched him, my father, glowing in that artificial light, proud of the perfection he thought he'd built. And I finally understood. His happiness had never been about love. It was about control, about proving to himself that his children could be trophies instead of truths. Sometimes love needs an enemy to survive. In our family, that enemy was me. Later, when the music started and the dance floor filled, I walked to the bar. The bartender recognized me, not by name, but by silence. "The usual, sir?" he asked. I almost laughed. "There's nothing usual about tonight." He poured the drink anyway. While I drank, my mother appeared. Her smile was soft, tired. "Don't take it personally," she said. "It's her day." I looked at her. When was mine? She sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from a lifetime of choosing peace over truth. She didn't answer. On the dance floor, my father was spinning my sister around, the cameras flashing like lightning. The crowd clapped. He leaned in to whisper something to her, and she laughed, not freely, but obediently. And I saw it then. She wasn't lucky. She was trapped in admiration. He didn't love her for who she was. He loved her because she validated him. That toast wasn't an insult. It was a confession. My father, in front of everyone, had admitted the one thing I'd always suspected, that he didn't understand love at all. He understood performance. He understood reward. But love? Love was just a story he told in public to make control sound poetic. The applause that followed him that night still rings in my head sometime. But when I replay it now, I don't hear celebration. I hear fear, the kind that keeps people clapping when they should be running. We're close to reaching 1,000 subscribers. Help me share these memories, not for sympathy, but for truth. And tell me, where are you listening from? I want to know how far this silence travels. Years later, I can still see that ballroom, golden, loud, immaculate, and I can still hear my father's voice echoing through it. To the only child who never disappointed me. He thought it was a toast. It was actually a eulogy. My father used to say, "A family is only as strong as its weakest link." He said it often enough that it stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like a threat. When I was a child, I thought he was talking about business, about the company, the estate, the endless machinery of success that defined our lives. But as I grew older, I realized what he really meant. Love was conditional, and disappointment was treason. From the very beginning, my sister and I were cast in opposite roles. She was light, I was shadow. She smiled easily, followed rules, said the right things at the right time. I questioned everything. I wanted reasons, not orders. He called her steady. He called me potential. And potential, in his language, was just failure waiting for confirmation. He loved her obedience, but he admired my defiance, quietly. resentfully. I could see it in the way he'd pause when I argued, the way his eyes would narrow as if he recognized a reflection he didn't like. Our childhood dinners were battles disguised as etiquette. He'd ask questions like riddles. What does responsibility mean? My sister would answer, with precision, his definition, recited like scripture. I'd say something about choice or conscience, and his smile would fade. That's philosophy, he'd say. Philosophy doesn't build empire. At 12, I learned to stop answering. At 15, I learned that silence was a form of self-defense. My sister never needed defense. She played her part perfectly, not because she wanted to, but because she thought it was the only way to keep peace. I didn't blame her. We were both trying to survive the same man, just in different languages. When she graduated at the top of her class, my father threw a party larger than most weddings. When I graduated, he sent a text. Congratulations, don't waste it. That was his love letter. Years later, when I dropped out of his chosen path, finance of course, he stopped speaking to me for months. My mother would call sometime, whispering so he wouldn't hear. He's proud of you, she'd say. He just doesn't know how to say it. But pride that hides itself is just fear pretending to be dignity. I visited home less and less. My room became a storage space for his trophies. Photos of him with politicians and CEOs replaced the pictures of us. As children, it was as if he'd erased the parts of me that didn't fit his version of fatherhood. And yet, somehow, I still wanted his approval. That's the cruelest thing about growing up with a man like that. Even when you know his love is poison, you keep drinking, hoping this time it won't hurt. When my sister met her future husband, my father was ecstatic. He was everything my father wanted in a son. Polite, ambitious, predictable. I remember the first dinner we had with him. My father poured wine, smiled and said, "Finally, a man who understands how to carry a name." He didn't look. When he said it, he didn't need to. Later that night, my sister found me on the balcony. She leaned against the railing, staring at the city lights below. "He's not as bad as you think," she said. "Who? Dad?" I laughed. "You'd defend him even if he set the house on fire," she sighed. "It's different for me." "I know, you don't." Her voice cracked when she said it. That was the first time I saw how much she'd given up to stay perfect, how much she'd swallowed just to stay adored. She turned to me. "Do you ever wonder why he needs us to be perfect?" "Because he isn't," I said. She didn't answer, but her silence was agreement. The next morning, I overheard them talking in his study. My father's voice was calm. Hers was small. "She's not ready," he said. "Marriage is a lifetime investment. Make sure you don't lose your value." Value. That was his favorite word. He used it like a weapon, never realizing that love loses all of it when measured. I remember walking away from the door, feeling that old, familiar ache, the one that came every time I realized my father spoke to us like shareholders, not children. When the wedding was announced, I didn't want to go. But my mother begged. "He'll notice if you're not there," she said. "He'll think you don't care." I wanted to say that he'd notice either way, but I agreed. Maybe I went out of habit, or maybe because part of me still believed that love could be repaired if you just showed up enough times. The day of the wedding, I stood near the altar, watching my sister walk down the aisle. She looked perfect, of course, but when she reached the end, she glanced at me. For just a heartbeat, her mask slipped. I saw fear, exhaustion, something that looked almost like a plea. That's when I understood. She wasn't marrying for herself. She was marrying for him. Our family didn't believe in love. We believed in legacy. When my father raised that glass later, toasting to the only child who never disappointed me, he wasn't celebrating her happiness. He was celebrating his control. It took me years to admit that I envied her. But the truth is, I didn't envy her praise. I envied her ability to survive it. Because in our house, being loved by him was just another kind of punishment. The morning after the wedding, the house looked like a battlefield that had been cleaned too quickly. The flowers were gone, the chairs stacked, the champagne glasses waiting to be counted. But the silence, that stayed. It lingered like smoke after a fire. I hadn't slept. I'd gone for a walk around the property at dawn, the dew soaking my shoes, the weight of that toast still sitting in my chest like a stone. When I came back, my father was already awake. He never slept in, not even after victory. He sat at the kitchen table reading the paper, a cup of coffee untouched beside him. The same ritual he'd repeated every morning of my childhood, control disguised as routine. Without looking up, he said, "You embarrassed yourself last night." I almost laughed. By standing there? By sulking. He folded the paper neatly. "You think people didn't notice?" "Notice what? That you humiliated your own son during your daughter's wedding?" He looked up slowly, the way predators do before they strike. "Don't be dramatic," he said. It was a toast, not a trial. Felt like both. He leaned back in his chair. You've always made everything about you, even your sister's happiness. She looked terrified. I said, you didn't see it, did you? Or maybe you did and didn't care. His eyes sharpened. You don't understand responsibility. That's your problem. She does. That's why she's married and you're still wandering. Wandering. I smiled faintly. That's your word for free. He stood up then, slow but deliberate. Freedom without purpose is failure. Purpose without love is prison. For a moment, the air between us froze. I could see something flicker behind his eyes. Not rage, not even contempt. Something closer to recognition. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He turned away. You sound like your mother, he muttered. That was his final insult. He left the room, and I was left, standing there, staring at the empty chair where his approval used to sit. Later that day, my sister came back from the hotel, where she and her husband had spent the night. She looked pale, tired. The makeup from the night before still clung to the corners of her eyes, like traces of a mask that wouldn't wash off. Did he talk to you? She asked. Of course, I said. He never misses an opportunity. She tried to smile but failed. He means well. No, I said quietly. He means control. She didn't argue. She just sat down beside me on the old porch swing and stared at the garden. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, when he made that toast, I wanted to stop him, but I couldn't. I know. I wanted to tell everyone that I've disappointed him too, just differently, by pretending to be everything he wanted. I looked at her, surprised. She'd never spoken like that before. I thought being perfect would make him love me, she said, but it just made me disappear. Her voice trembled when she said it. That's when I realized we were both ghosts. One resented, the other worshipped, but both equally invisible. I hate that toast, she whispered. I hate that. He made you hear it. I hate that he made you live it, I replied. We sat in silence again, the kind of silence that's too heavy for words, too honest for comfort. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He wrote this last night, she said. It was a note, handwritten, like all his orders. It said, proud of you. Don't ever forget what your success cost this family. She looked at me. What does that even mean? It means you're his favorite prisoner, I said. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. In our family, crying was weakness, and weakness was the one sin he never forgave. When she left, she hugged me for the first time in years. I'm sorry, she said. For what? For letting him use me to hurt you. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that we were both just weapons he'd pointed at each other. But the words didn't come. That night, I packed my bags. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. As I walked past the garage, I saw my father's car parked under the dim lights. The same model my grandfather once drove. The same one that had been passed to my sister years before. I thought about all the symbols he'd used to measure us. Cars, degrees, weddings, obedience, and how none of it ever added up to love. I drove until the city lights disappeared behind me, until I could breathe again. I stopped at a small motel near the coast, opened the window, and let the sound of the sea drown out his voice in my... That night, I wrote a letter I never sent. It said, you taught me that love must be earned. You were wrong. Love that must be earned is just approval, and approval dies the moment we stop performing. I hope one day you realize that, before you run out of people willing to perform for you. I folded the paper and left it. On the nightstand, it's still there, somewhere, yellowing with time. Years passed before I saw my sister again. Our father's name still carried weight, enough to fill rooms, enough to silence questions, but his health had started to crumble. Control is a muscle, and like every muscle, it eventually failed. The first time she called me after years of silence, her voice was soft. He's sick, she said. I asked, how bad? She paused. Bad enough that he wants to see you. I almost laughed. Wants to see me, or wants to be seen forgiving me? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. When I arrived at the house, it felt smaller, not because it had changed, but because I had. The air still smelled of his cologne, cedar, and something metallic, like a man trying to scent himself with power. The portraits on the walls hadn't aged, only the people inside them. He was in his study, of course, always his study, the control room, the throne, the cage. He looked older, but not weaker. Even sickness hadn't stripped him of his authority. It had only sharpened it. His skin was pale, his voice rough, but his eyes, those eyes, were the same, assessing, measuring, disappointed. You came, he said. I did, I replied. You asked. He smiled faintly. I didn't ask. I expected. That was the closest thing to affection he ever gave. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit. I sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the clock ticking behind him. Slow, deliberate, like a metronome for regret. Finally, he said, "Your sister tells me you're doing well." "I'm living," I said. "That's better than I was before." He nodded, but his eyes narrowed slightly, as if living without his approval was a crime. "I've been thinking about mistakes." "About yours or mine?" He smirked. "Both, though yours are easier to remember." I leaned back, studying him. "You still can't help it, can you? Even now." "Help what?" "Turning every conversation into a hierarchy." He looked at me for a long time, and then surprisingly said, "It's the only language I know." That was the first honest thing he'd ever said to me. I wanted to hate him in that moment, but what I felt instead was something worse. Pity. Because I realized he wasn't a tyrant by choice. He was one by inheritance. He'd been trained to rule instead of love, to command instead of feel. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. "You think I didn't love you," he said. "I know you didn't love me the way a father should." He nodded. "Maybe, but you needed someone to push you. I needed someone to see me." He looked away then, as if the truth had weight. "If I had been softer," he said, "you'd be weaker." I shook my head. "No, if you had been softer, I'd be whole." The silence that followed was long and heavy, a silence full of everything we'd never said. When I left the room, my sister was standing in the hallway. She'd been listening, I think. Her eyes were wet. "He's dying," she said. "I know. He doesn't have much time." I looked past her, toward the study door. He never did. A week later, he was gone. The funeral was immaculate, of course. Men in dark suits, women in pearls, speeches about legacy and leadership. No one mentioned love. No one ever did. After the service, my sister and I walked together to the car, the same car my father once gave her. It was old now, the paint fading, the engine coughing softly like a tired heart. She stopped beside it. "He left it to you," she said. I stared at her. "What?" "In the will." He said it belonged to the one who understood its meaning. I almost laughed. "Meaning?" "It was always a weapon." She smiled sadly. "Maybe now it's a key." She handed me the keys, the same ones that had once divided us. I took them without knowing why. That night, I drove to the ocean. The wind was cold, the stars sharp and unkind. I parked near the cliffs, the same way I had years ago when I walked away from him the first time. The car smelled of memory, of childhood and punishment and silence. I sat there for a long time, thinking about him, about her, about the strange inheritance we'd both been forced to carry. He'd built an empire, but he'd left us ruins, beautiful, polished ruins that still whispered the same lie: you must earn what should be freely given. I finally understood the truth he never could. Love that demands perfection isn't love, it's accounting. I started the engine. The car coughed, then steadied, the sound oddly human. I drove until the city disappeared behind me, until the horizon swallowed everything. For a moment, I imagined him in the passenger seat, silent as always, judging the way I gripped the wheel. But then I rolled down the window, let the wind in, and, for the first time, didn't care what he thought. When I reached the edge of the cliff, I stopped. The ocean was black and endless. I took the keys from the ignition, turned them in my hand, and whispered, "You can rest now." Then I threw them into the water. They hit the surface with a sound so small it barely existed. But in that sound, I heard something close to peace. Driving back, I realized my father was right about one thing. You can only measure a man by what he builds. But he never understood that what we build inside ourselves matters more than what we build around us. He built walls. I built distance. But my sister, she built freedom. Sometimes I wonder if he'd be proud. Then I remember, pride was never the point. Love was. And for the first time in my life, I finally knew what it felt like. Not because of him, but in spite of him. I thought his toast was the end of me. It wasn't. It was the beginning of someone he never wanted me to become, myself. If this story made you think, subscribe, not for me, but for every son who spent a lifetime mistaking silence for strength and finally learned that peace sounds nothing like applause.